The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com. The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee, perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is the Byte Show. We're very, very blessed to have with us Joseph P. Farrell. And Joseph has some very special announcements tonight. And we'll get right to that. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the power of stones. We're going to be talking about the crystal skull and the Nazca lines and things in that direction. This is going to be very interesting. As always, with Joseph. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, GeorgeAnn. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, anytime. Anytime. Why don't we just get right to the announcements?
All right.
And we'll do it again before we close.
Sure. Well, I wanted to let everybody know, I just heard from my publisher today that they have received the new book, which is called Secrets of the Unified Field, and the subtitle is The Philadelphia Experiment, the Nazi Bell, and the Discarded Theory.
Wow.
They just received that today, and that means that usually, you know, I've mentioned before that I've actually worked at my publisher, so I know their procedures. That means they usually turn right around and ship several pallets out to their distributor.
Right.
So for those of your listeners who've done pre-orders through Barnes & Noble or Amazon, those should still be, I'd say, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks before their local store will fill the order, so that if your listeners do order that book, my recommendation is for now, that they still go directly through Adventures Unlimited, because those orders will fill a lot faster. Adventures Unlimited is usually pretty good about taking orders and getting them out either that day or the very next day. So that would be my recommendation on that. The second announcement is I do want to thank all of those people that have made donations. There, one gentleman even sent me a set of DVDs. I guess he has a production company and does DVDs, and I actually watched one today and found it to be rather fascinating on some possible Martian anomalies. So I want to thank people for doing that. I'm still short, but again, you know, it was kind of a shameless appeal
Joseph,
for donations. But
yeah, let me jump in here. Joseph Farrell works very hard to bring all of this information, and he is a premier researcher and highly gifted. There is just practically nobody out there like Joseph P. Farrell. And I think that for those of you especially that listen to these audio files, you should be chipping in and helping Joseph. He is in need of some donations. And, you know, you reap what you sow, people, so pay attention.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I do want to announce in that respect, and this was really kind of where I was going with the announcement, is I did get my PayPal button up on the website, so if people prefer to do that, that's up and running. It's actually working. So, but I do appreciate those people, and I wanted to make sure and say thank you to them for sending money in the mails, because it is tremendously appreciated, and I'm very grateful to all of you. And third announcement.
Wow, this is a zinger.
Yeah,
I love this announcement. Whoa.
Well,
yes.
I don't know if your listeners are aware. You've mentioned that doing the little biographical announcements about me. But of course, my academic background is actually in patristic theology, which is kind of the theology of the church in the first 1,000 years. And of course, that kind of academic background, you have to know a lot of languages and philosophy and history and so on and so forth. It's actually a very broad degree. It sounds like it's a very specialized one, but it's quite the reverse. But in my days as a professor, I did teach secular history quite a lot, but I always tried to teach it from what I considered to be an informed academic background in the Christian religion. And of course, you really can't study things like medieval history without having some idea of what's going on. But anyway, toward the end of my career, my students that had been with me through several courses kind of demanded that I spill the beans, so to speak, because they kind of sensed that I was not saying everything I could. So they talked me into doing this honors philosophy seminar for the University of Oklahoma. And the dean of the College of Classics and Letters granted permission, a very good man. And so I did this seminar in which I spilled the beans. And the seminar was called God, History, and Dialectic.
Right.
And the subtitle of that seminar was The Theological Foundations of the Two Europes and Their Cultural Consequences. In other words, it deals with the subject of why we even have an Eastern Europe and a Western Europe. And the reasons why are all theological, in spite of what you might read in a modern American secular textbook on the subject. But anyway, at the end of that course, much to my surprise, the students gave me a standing ovation. It was one of 3 that I had received when I was teaching in college.
Well deserved, I might add.
Well, thank you. It was certainly a shock. But then they kind of insisted, and I know I'm going around Harvey's barn again to tell this announcement. But they kind of insisted that I was making recordings of the lectures, and several students were as well, and I'd, of course, typed up little talking points before each class. And they kind of insisted that I transcribe these things and sell them because they like them so much. So I spent 2 weeks laboriously, nonstop it seemed like at times, typing this up. And it turned into a work that was called, again, God, History, Dialectic, the Theological Foundations of the Two Europes and Their Cultural Consequences. So I sold these, little kind of hand-bound, typed-up copies of this monster academic tome to these interested students. Well, much to my surprise, and that's all I ever did with the book, much to my surprise, for some reason, and this was back in 1995, about 13 years ago, in fact, the book, in spite of having given it out to so few people, kept kind of circulating, I guess, kind of samizdat style in the theological underground, or I don't know what you'd call it. And very recently, in the last couple of years, some more people heard about it, and, people kept asking for copies of this thing until finally I sold a couple to an individual who actually had driven all the way from Dallas to Topeka to buy one from me directly. And they had a website, and they started posting excerpts from this book. It's actually a 1,200-page monster, and 350 pages of that are footnotes. So, it's a monster. Well, the demand for the book actually, in spite of my unwillingness actually to make it an actual book or ever to publish it, the demand for it, much to my surprise, kept growing. So I finally decided, just in the last couple of months, to let a friend of mine publish it as an e-book. So that book is now out there. It's the fourth one of the theological books that I've written long ago, and it's available as well as an ebook. So, in other words, there's there's lots going on, and I'm scarcely able to keep up with it all anymore.
Joseph, where can people get this ebook?
The ebook is at a website that's called www.filioque, and I'll spell that, filioque.com. And Filioque is spelled Filioque. So it's www.filioque.com. It's a PDF format of the exact way the book was typed up, typos and all. It is rather expensive because it did take me a long time, and it represents about 20 years of my theological book or theological research. But I finally decided to release that too, so I've got lots going on here.
Yes, and I'm glad.
Well, thank you.
Very glad. Okay. That link will be on your website on the Byte Show, and people can go there and get this book.
Well, thank you.
And it's an important book. So if you love this man's work, this book is his heart and soul. And a lot of learning went into making this book, so I highly recommend it.
And a lot of typing.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I think my fingers were bruised at the end of that 2 weeks.
Your knuckles got
Yes, that's right. I wore my fingers down to nubs. You know, it was one of those sessions.
Oh my goodness. Well, we will go through this again before we close the show.
Mm-hmm.
We're stones.
Stones
of power.
Mm-hmm.
Ancient physics.
Mm-hmm.
Ancient weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Stones of destiny. Tables of destiny. Crystal skulls.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are there 13 of these skulls?
Well, this is you jumped right in the deep end tonight.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
What else is new?
Well, that's a big Pandora's box.
Yes.
Well, to kind of put all this in a perhaps a contemporary and entertaining perspective, as you know, George Lucas is coming out with the fourth Indiana Jones movie, and it's called Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls. And there's actually a piece about the movie in Vanity Fair magazine that you can look up online. That's very interesting. But the really interesting stuff in the article that are about the movie is on the last page and a couple paragraphs toward the top of the page. Apparently, the movie has a beginning in New Mexico, supposedly filmed and shot actually at a place or location in New Mexico very close to Roswell, and supposedly designed to look like Area 51. And the crystal skull in question is supposed to be alien and E.T., and supposedly, according to Vanity Fair, there is a Soviet agent. You know, he's gone from dealing with Nazis to dealing with communists. You know?
Oh boy!
Yeah, you know, trade one bad dream for another. You know? But anyway, the Soviets are apparently after this thing, and of course, the article doesn't really say much more about it. Well, to me, I found this very interesting because if you look at Lucas himself, if you look at George Lucas and his film output, he really is famous for basically those two themes in his movies. One, of course, being the theme of the cosmic war in the 6 films of the Star Wars saga, and the other being this quest for ancient lost science through archaeological digs and processes of that sort. And with this film, to me, GeorgeAnn, I find it very interesting that he's kind of closing the circle between these two themes. Because here he has Indiana Jones going after this crystal skull, which is supposed to be extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
And, you know, to me, that's very interesting because I wrote about the crystal skulls in the Giza Death Star way back in my first book.
Yes.
And again about them in the second to the last chapter of the third pyramid book called The Giza Death Star Destroyed. And what I find very interesting with this whole archaeological theme that Lucas, you know, perforce is going to have to address in this movie is if we take the most famous of these crystal skulls, which is the Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull, there have been reports in the literature about them that really go back to Phyllis Galdi and her famous book on the crystal skulls, in which she reported that the art critic Frank Dorland took to Hewlett-Packard this Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull, and they did all sorts of tests on it. And what they discovered was not only was this thing quartz, but they did not have any clue as to how the thing could have been made.
Right.
Because not only is it so highly polished, you know, quartz is an incredibly hard crystal. It's 8 on the most hardness scale of crystals, you know, which is right below ruby and sapphire and diamond. So in other words, it's very, very hard material. And secondly, this is almost pure quartz. There's if you've seen pictures of the crystal skull, this particular one, it's clear. It's as clear and transparent as glass. It has very, very few defects in it. But the most interesting thing about it, and I think I've mentioned this in a prior installment in this series, the most peculiar thing about it, GeorgeAnn, is that it has optical properties that appear to be similar to fiber optics on the inside of the skull. These little channels of quartz crystal that will take any light shown from below the skull, bend it through this solid lump of quartz, and shine it out through the eyes. And no one at Hewlett-Packard could figure out how on earth a bunch of Mayan Indians in the 8th century, which was the geological layer that this thing was actually discovered in by Mitchell-Hedges himself, no one could figure out how this thing was made. In other words, we do not have the technology to reproduce this thing today.
Well, just because it was discovered in that particular layer of that reflects a particular time frame doesn't mean that is when it was crafted.
Well, exactly so. Yeah, exactly so. And this leads us to the real problem, because the Mayans had certain traditions about it. But you mentioned the number 13, and this is where it really gets intriguing, because there's a North American Cherokee Indian legend that there were 13 of these skulls, and that they contained information, and that at their understanding of the end days or the last days or age or whatever you wish to call it, these 13 skulls would be reassembled and their wisdom unlocked for humanity in its hour of need. You know, that typical old theme that you encounter so much. Well, what I find interesting about this Cherokee legend is that they also state very explicitly that these 13 skulls represent the planets of the solar system, with the 13th skull and the most important one representing the sun. Now, this is an extremely odd thing, because you will find a very similar, not just similar, it's identical enumeration of the celestial bodies of the solar system in only one other place, and guess where that is? Sumeria.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, really. You know, remember Sitchin's book, The 12th Planet?
Yes.
Well, I mean, you know, this is a fairly well-known fact about Sumerian astronomy, is that they numbered 12 planets. They were reckoning certain things as being genuinely planets, like our moon, which it certainly is. I mean, when you stop and think about the astronomical data of the Earth-Moon system, what we really are is a double planetary system. The moon is just an enormously large satellite for a planet as small as the Earth. You know, it's a planet in its own right. So, you know, the Sumerian connection here is just, to me, dumbfounding, because here are, you know, a world away across the Atlantic Ocean, you have the Cherokee Indians saying the same thing. And what's really interesting here is precisely the glimmers or implications of an astrological association with this, because once again we find a legend concerning crystals or stones. They apparently contain some sort of power or information, and, you know, in this case, the crystal skulls. And we find it associated, these crystal skulls deliberately associated with the planetary system. So in other words, the parallels to me are just too many to be coincidental. And this leaves only really about three possibilities of explanation for it. Either the Sumerians learned it from the Cherokees learned it from the Sumerians. That would be one.
Yes.
You know, and we do know that there was a considerable more degree of transoceanic travel back in those ancient classical times than hitherto had been thought. So, you know, that's one possible explanation. The other possible explanation is that they both got more or less the same tradition from somebody else.
Yes.
And that each of these two separate civilizations, and the Cherokee were very civilized, each of these two separate civilizations had their own peculiar legacy or tradition of preserving it. In other words, we see once again that possibility of a very high civilization with a very sophisticated science that declines into these respective Sumerian and Cherokee legends. And, you know, that that to me, again, is just sort of dumbfounding.
Yeah, it is. Well, none of these people throughout time have had the lapidary skills necessary to produce this.
Oh, yes. Well, you know, this brings up an interesting question, because there's a fellow, a professor at Harvard out there who's supposedly the world's most famous expert on crystal skulls. And to be quite honest, he's right. Many of these skulls that are touted as being ancient really aren't. They're probably forgeries.
Yeah.
But there are a few that cannot really be explained, and you certainly cannot explain the most famous of these skulls, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, as being a forgery, because we simply cannot reproduce this thing. And, you know, it defies, you know, you may be able to explain the polishing of the skull itself as being the result of some very careful, skilled polishing over millennia. You know, you may be able to do that. But explaining those optical interior fiber optic channels inside of it is a totally different matter. So, you know, as I said before, I suspect that this particular example of that rather peculiar artifact may have been a crystal that had been deliberately grown for the purpose and then subsequently, you know, polished and sanded down to its current form.
Well, it's a solid block of crystal.
It is a solid block of quartz crystal, yes.
It's not pieces.
No, it isn't. Although it should be noted that the Mitchell-Hedges skull has a lower jaw that is movable and detachable from the upper part of the skull, which again, that's some pretty involved lapidary skill. And the final thing is that particular skull is the most anatomically correct of them all. You could be looking at, if you didn't know better, you could be looking at a modern casting of glass that had been made from an actual human skull. It is that remarkably accurate. The rest of them don't have that same high degree of precision or finish. So it's almost, in its way, it's kind of the great pyramid of crystal skulls. You really can't explain the thing, and every example of the art after that declines from that standard. So, it's a very interesting thing, and I just find it, extremely interesting that George Lucas has decided to take these two major themes of his cinematic output, cosmic war and space on the one hand, and a professor going around the world digging for ancient artifacts and talismans of power on the other, and close the circle like he does. To me, that's extraordinarily interesting. So I'm kind of waiting with bated breath for the movie to come out and see what's actually in it.
That makes two of us. Oh boy, Joseph, is there or could there be a connection between this skull and the Mayan calendar?
Well, I am not an expert on the Mayan calendar. I've tended deliberately to shy away from that because, to me, it's a subject that is too overgrown with catastrophist and New Age eschatological views and so on.
Okay.
I just really don't know that much about it to be able to comment. I do think that it is interesting, however, that this Cherokee legend does definitely imply that these 13 skulls will be reassembled prior to the final age because they contain information. And again, that's an extraordinarily sophisticated thing to say.
Oh, yeah.
To say that crystals, that a lattice structure contains information.
Yeah, well, I remember last time we talked about the crystalline lattice structure and the templates.
Right, yes, we did.
Of God's book in the heavens.
Right, yes. Well, all of this, again, all of this, you connect the dots together, and to me, again, it spells a picture that we're looking at the considerably decayed residue of some sort of very sophisticated science that once existed. Because, as I've mentioned many times before in these interviews, this idea of space itself having a quantized structure, a cellular lattice structure, is an extraordinarily sophisticated view. I mean, the papers for this type of thing really only start appearing in the modern scientific literature within the last 10 to 20 years. You can stretch it further back if you want to extend it a little bit, but certainly it doesn't go any further back than the beginning of the last century. So it's an extraordinarily sophisticated scientific view that you're dealing with here, and I find no other way of explaining it. What's it doing there in a Cherokee legend? It's as out of place there as finding it in the Sumerian legends because, it's out of place there. So we're dealing with, I think, once again, very clearly, a declination from a very sophisticated science that used to exist. And to me, that's the real story here. And I'm, I even posted an article, GeorgeAnn, on my website, which is www.gizadeathstar.com. Prior to learning and reading this article about this new Indiana Jones film, I posted a short article on my website there about the actual mythological influences on George Lucas, and they are clear and they are specific. There's no getting around them. once you know who it is that kind of hovers in the background as his advisor, you'll recognize the name immediately. So in other words, he may be closing the circle on something very significant with this movie, and I'm like I say, I'm waiting with bated breath.
Do I dare ask who the advisor is?
Sure. Joseph Campbell.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Well, you know, okay, when we look at, when I have looked at, because I've been down there years ago and looked at the Mayan ruins,
mm-hmm.
the Aztec ruins, all
mm-hmm.
of that, the Mayan calendar,
mm-hmm.
to me, all of that looks like, at first glance, circuitry.
Yeah, some of that stuff, you know, those wonderfully stylized Mayan petroglyphs and paintings, they're beautiful and grotesque at the same time.
Right.
But some of the ligatures and figures that you see on those things, you're right, they do look suspiciously like some sort of dimly remembered circuitry or machine or something, you know.
Yes.
And I'm not trying to subscribe here to the Erich von Däniken Chariots of the Gods approach. I'm certainly not, but nonetheless, the analogical connections are really there. You know, I pointed out way back in the Giza Death Star the figure of Viracocha on the Gate of the Sun down at Lake Tiahuanaco in Bolivia. And the odd fact that if you look at that in a certain way, it looks like a very stylized representation of a modern fission, fusion, fission hydrogen bomb, you know, a three-stage thermonuclear weapon. So, and I say that because you can actually find online basic simplified schematics of Dr. Edward Teller, his design for some of the first deliverable hydrogen bombs, and that's exactly what you see. You know?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It's just kind of creepy, but you know, you can look at these things analogically and start seeing them in a different way, and you put all that together. You know, I should clarify something here.
Okay.
When I say I'm not a subscriber to von Däniken, the reason I'm not is that he attempted to base his case almost entirely on those types of similarities between pictured objects and modern equivalents or analogs. And I'm really not doing that. My sole focus is on a detailed examination of texts. To me, that's where the prima facie case for what I'm saying about this ancient civilization and its sophisticated science really must be based. But once having said that, then you can look at this other stuff and say, oh yeah, ain't that weird? Because this stuff there does seem to be kind of secondary corroborative evidence if you look at it in that way. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not arguing a case based on a kind of von Däniken approach that anyone who's actually read my books will see very quickly that this is not what I'm doing. So.
Right. Well, you know, if we look at these glyphs, you know, and the Mayans and the Aztecs, even the ancient Hebrew language, there's I don't know, Joseph, I mean, could we say that it's a different type of mathematical language?
Oh, yes. You know, you mentioned the Hebrew language, and I think I mentioned this way back in one of the early sessions, but it's worth mentioning again that a Jewish mathematician, a fellow by the name of Stan Tenen, has been assiduously compiling a mountain of data about what the Hebrew modern Hebrew characters look like under three-dimensional rotations. And, you know, the very idea that you would take letters of an alphabet and rotate them into three dimensions, you know, it's pretty mind-boggling. But when you actually see some of these dimensional rotations, what they look like, it's very clear that you're dealing with some, you know, I can see in some cases resemblances to plasma generations and Birkeland currents and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of interesting things that pop out of these rotations. So, you know, you have a mathematical, a modern-day mathematical confirmation of an ancient Jewish esoteric tradition that the Hebrew characters are, in some sense, also to be understood as mathematical in nature. It's been a very, very old part of Gematria and Kabbalah and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But the other interesting thing is that linguists down in South America, there's a tribe of Indians that live right around Lake Tiwanaku in Bolivia, you know, where this ancient sun gate of Viracocha is. And they're called the Almira Indians. And linguists noticed that their language was very unusual in terms of the family of human languages, because it appeared to be a language that was almost deliberately constructed as an algorithm to be able to translate anything into it and out of it into another language.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, it has a great deal of translational sophistication, as if it had been designed deliberately to translate other languages. You know. So, in other words, it's kind of a meta language if you want to look at it in that way. It's kind of a confirmation of some of the theories of Noam Chomsky in certain respects. You know, the idea of a universal innate grammatical competence that human beings share, and that human languages seem to share certain basic universal grammatical properties. Well, you know, here we have a language that seems to fit that very bill very directly, and it's very old. And interestingly enough, you know, just to sweeten the pot, I don't mention this in the Giza Death Star, but I'll mention it here. These Almira Indians build these reed boats with very high prows. And guess what boats they look the most alike to? Ancient Egyptian barks.
Oh my goodness!
You can actually see pictures of these Almira Indian boats, and if you look at them and then compare some of those ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, you'll see an amazing and astonishing architectural and engineering similarity between these boats. So, you know, there's yet another little tantalizing thing that just really defy conventional academic explanations. And again, I think you have to entertain at this point in the game, you know, with so many researchers out there talking about all of the different aspects of this problem, I think the mountain of evidence is to this point strong enough that it should be academically entertained. I mean, you should be hearing about this stuff in the universities, and of course you're not.
Well, you're right. Well, there's a lot of things we should be doing in our universities.
True.
And our other lower grades, school grades that are not being done.
Yes.
And it really boggles my mind, Joseph.
Yes, it does mine too. That's why I got out of it.
Yeah. I understand. Well, the Amazon, I know that years ago someone gave me a book by Berlitz. And there was a photograph in there of like a satellite photograph or from a high-flying airplane of jungle. And there was a series of what looked to be pyramids in this jungle. And it was said that no one had successfully gone in there and ever come back.
Well, now there is a subject we haven't touched on.
Oh, good. Let's.
And to be honest with you, I only skimmed the top of it, and to be honest, I can't even remember in which book I did. Isn't that weird? But there was an expedition into the Amazon.
Yes.
By the famous Colonel Percy Fawcett, British colonel and archaeologist, into the Amazon because he had heard rumors and tales from some of his Indian guides and so on that there existed deep within the Amazon jungles cities, lost cities, that were lit, according to their legends, by crystals that glowed.
Yeah.
And, of course, he, being an archaeologist, wanted to go find these things, so off the intrepid Colonel Fawcett went and was never heard from again. And the expedition is fairly famous. Well, I got to digging around in my researches for the pyramid books, and just kind of thought that was another little confirmation. Here again, we have this legend of crystals and so on and so forth and lost civilizations. Well, interestingly enough, one of the most sensational things I uncovered, I even mentioned this in the footnote, and again, I apologize to your listeners, I can't even remember which one of my own books I put it in, but tells me I ought to go back and read them, when you finish a book, it's the closest thing men ever come to giving birth, so when you finish, you just tend to forget about them. So anyway, in this footnote, I mentioned it in the footnote because I ran across this thing and I wanted to mention it in the main text, but I just couldn't really dig up any more information about it. But there was a famous German archaeologist between the wars that thought, well, Fawcett was being rather stupid. Why don't we just fly over the area with one of our Zeppelins? And in fact, he actually proposed using the Graf Zeppelin, which was kind of the earlier, smaller version of the Hindenburg, and just fly over the region and do all sorts of fancy camera work with it and, literally do archaeology from the air. That was his phrase. And he actually started to put this expedition together. He'd contacted the Zeppelin company in Germany and they were willing if the price was right, because, after all, this was one of their transatlantic airships, carrying people back and forth. And the expedition was all ready to go, and then, of course, the Graf Zeppelin was struck by lightning, and since it was filled with hydrogen, it blew up. So the expedition never came off. But I mention this because, to me, it is extremely interesting that they are using satellites now, not only, in my suspicion, to take photographs of these, and they have seen these pyramids and so on, not only to take photographs of them, but my suspicion is, GeorgeAnn, they're doing a lot more. Namely, they're doing, they're doing radar tomography. In other words, underground mapping.
Yes.
With these satellites. And they're not talking. They're not talking. And incidentally, I know you, I know you talk a great deal with Jerry Smith, a fellow Adventures Unlimited author. And you know that he has a book out about HAARP, right, the High Altitude Auroral Research Project. Yes. Well, it's my suspicion and that of a few others, and it really began to be voiced by Dr. Nick Begich back when he first wrote his book, Angels Don't Play This Harp. He mentioned it only in passing, but I think it's one of the most significant things. He mentioned that HAARP might be capable of aiding or assisting in radar tomography, in other words, underground penetrating radar to map underground caverns and fissures and so on and so forth. It's my suspicion that now that HAARP is full power that it is probably capable of doing radar tomography of the moon.
Oh, my goodness.
So you see, somebody, put all this together, connect all the dots. Somebody somewhere is doing an awful lot of digging.
Oh, yeah.
And they're doing it in a very sneaky, clever, technologically sophisticated way that they never have to turn a spade of dirt and let anybody else know they're doing it.
Right.
Right.
What was the name of the man? Fawcett?
Percy Fawcett. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. In Nevada,
mm-hmm.
here last year,
mm-hmm.
a highly experienced aviator
mm-hmm.
by the name of Steve Fawcett
mm-hmm.
came up missing. They could not find the wreckage of his airplane.
Huh.
And, my goodness, they found airplane wreckage from decades ago,
mm-hmm.
but they couldn't find him.
Right.
I just thought it strange. His name is Fawcett, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, Percy Fawcett, that expedition was one of the most famous archaeological failures on record, because he was a well-known archaeologist, a certain amount of respect in the community, and he had done Amazon expeditions before, so he had experience. He knew which Indian guides to contact and do this sort of thing. So it's not as if we're talking about an amateur here.
Right.
But, to have some, and besides that, of course, he had a military background. So, that we're talking about someone of his caliber disappearing into the jungles of the Amazon and never being heard from again, that's rather significant, I think. And of course, all sorts of speculations and stories have arisen about what might have happened to him since then. But, the bottom line is nobody knows.
Well, when I saw this photograph, Joseph, these things are all overgrown by jungle.
Oh, yes.
And there's one huge one, and they say it would dwarf the size of the Pyramid at Giza, the main one. They said it's huge. And then there are a series of smaller ones, each one smaller than the next.
Well, if you find the link to that picture, I'd love to see it, because, what I find interesting is you mentioned the jungle overgrowth.
Yes.
Well, in 2006, I think it was, National Geographic ran an article about a similar discovery in Central America of a Mayan pyramid that they didn't even know was there, because it had overgrown so much with jungle and dirt and trees and stuff that people just thought it was a mountain, until somebody, got looking at it and noticed, hey, mountains don't have four neat sides.
Right.
So they dug, and lo and behold, they find this lost Mayan pyramid, and, that work is still going on. So those things are there. I mean, it's not as if they're not.
Well, Guatemala is rich with these kind of buildings and artifacts and things.
Right.
A lot of thievery has
oh,
gone
yes.
on. Yeah. True. Oh, my goodness. Well, there's another weapon. And it was referred to as the flood wind weapon.
Yes.
Migalgal. And it produced a blinding light. And that reminded me when the messengers, the angels of God, went to Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, and they had, remember the story, this blinding light. I'm wondering if they had this weapon.
Well, it's interesting. Certainly, I am increasingly inclined to view some passages in the Old Testament as being descriptions of the use of a technology of some sort.
Yes.
And again, I stress the fact that I'm not putting that in opposition to the standard spiritual explanations at all.
Exactly.
But, because that's the ancient frame of mind. They don't have this nice, modern, Western European post-Enlightenment, neat, tidy division of the spiritual and the physical. They just don't. And the sooner we get used to that fact, the better off we'll all be. A lot of church history will be more intelligible if one can overcome that opposition. But in terms of the flood weapon, the wind weapon, or the Megal-Gal in the Sumerian texts, and that's a term, incidentally, that is reserved solely in those texts for divine weapons of mass destruction. I should stress that fact.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what it means. That's what it always occurs in those contexts. Well, I would be inclined to follow the academic reading of such descriptions as being merely mythological if it were not for the fact that in so many other Sumerian myths, you have lengthy passages, like in the Enuma Elish that I talk about in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, and the Lugal-A and the exploits of Ninurta that I talk about in the Cosmic War, and you know those books. I've reproduced those passages, quoted them at length.
I know, and I've underlined all of them.
Well, I've quoted them at length, and I've quoted standard academic translations to boot. I'm not quoting or making my own translations. I'm not exposing myself to the accusation that so many critics have hurled at Zecharia Sitchin for mistranslating things.
Right.
Because I'm using accepted academic translations into English. And I quote them at length in those books because I want people to be able to see that when I start breaking them down and analyzing them in terms of some of these modern alternative physics notions, that is exactly what they're describing. So that when we turn to expressions like the wind weapon, the flood weapon, the great blinding crystals, and so on and so forth, that are described not at any great length, but just kind of in passing in some other passages, you can see, or at least your mind is open to the possibility that these references, too, are describing something technological in nature. And when we're dealing with, wind weapons and flood weapons, well, the very idea of using weather as a weapon is yet again a modern idea. It only begins to be really talked about seriously in military circles after the end of World War II, when at least the theoretical physics and some of the basic rudimentary technologies for being able to manipulate weather are coming into existence. So again, I look at expressions like that, and I have to say that we cannot, if we are capable of envisioning such things, and Jerry Smith, again, to go back to his book, Weather Warfare, for a moment, he's done an enormous amount of documentation on what they're actually thinking and the technologies they're actually proposing to do this with. So the idea is not far-fetched. Well, if we posit the idea of an ancient high civilization that had a sophisticated science like I've been suggesting in these books, then certainly if they can blow up planets, they're certainly capable of manipulating weather on a planetary scale, And that's exactly, incidentally, what you find, as you've mentioned, in these ancient Sumerian mythologies. You find them doing exactly that.
Yeah, Thor through his
thunderbolt, or Zeus through his thunderbolt. Well, who is he throwing them at?
Yes, exactly.
And you mentioned the thunderbolt. In the Cosmic War, I reproduce a frieze of the Sumerian god Ninurta that was found on a palace wall of Ashurbanipal, the famous Assyrian king. And Ninurta is holding in his right hand, he is holding this divine thunderbolt. And I reproduce this because the shape of the thunderbolt that he's holding looks like a pitchfork. You know, you take the end off of two pitchforks, make it a three-pronged pitchfork. You take the end of two pitchforks off and then glue them together so that each pitchfork is kind of back-to-back to each other. Well, this is what that divine thunderbolt in Ninurta's hand on this frieze that I put the picture in the book looks like. Well, interestingly enough, that same shape, almost identical shape, can be reproduced in a plasma physics laboratory as a plasma discharge. You know, so again, even in the artistic depictions, we may be looking at a residue of something that was deliberately preserved, although they didn't know why they were doing it. They just knew that this is what Ninurta's thunderbolt or Zeus's or Thor's or whoever looked like.
Yeah.
The question is, how did they know that?
Yeah, how did they know that, and where did they get it from?
And where did they get it from?
Now, which is older, the Hebrew or the Sumerian?
The Sumerian.
Okay.
The Sumerian.
How much older?
Well, it depends on which aspect of their mythological tradition you look at. I mean, there are hundreds of tablets and so on.
Oh, yes.
If not thousands.
Yeah, they say that there are you can't even count them in
the
basement of the British Museum.
Yeah, and most of them untranslated.
Right.
Which I, again, find suspicious.
Yeah, me too.
But, no, the Sumerian, it depends on which particular myth you're looking at, but there are certain tablets, for example, of the myth of Anzu that were found at Tel Amarna in Egypt that were found in a strata that would date it to circa 1500 BC. So that is slightly ahead of the Exodus of the Hebrews, and by a standard conventional and traditional dating, not a modern higher critical dating of the Torah or the Pentateuch or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That would place it approximately 100 to 150 years ahead of their composition. So, you know, it depends on which myth you're looking at in terms of a comparison.
What is the oldest known text of the Torah?
Well, it would be the Pentateuch. It would be all of it. If you look at certain Well,
I know, Joseph, a lot of it was written, passed down in oral tradition.
Well, that is a scholarly theory. This will probably be one of the subjects we will be discussing at great length, in the series on the other book that just came out. But I am not a subscriber to most modern schools of biblical scholarship because...
Praise God for that.
Well, because the effort began in the 18th century. It has some very murky and suspicious beginnings, too, that most people are unaware of, and when you read them in that new book, you will be dumbfounded what they are. You will literally be dumbfounded.
Yeah, and Joseph is absolutely telling you the truth. You've got to get this new book.
Well, it's a monster, but in any case, I'm not a subscriber to the whole enterprise of higher criticism for a number of complicated historical and theological reasons that would get us far afield from the subject tonight. But I'm very suspicious of the whole oral transmission and tradition idea that has been used a great deal in those scholarly explanations of how the text was handed down. I'm extremely suspicious of them. They seem to me to fly in the face of the standard scribal and priestcraft tradition of that region of the world, which was meticulous in not only its setting down of important things in written form,
Yes.
but extremely meticulous in the mechanisms that it put into place to make sure that accurate copies were transcribed. So, I'm just I'm just not of a piece with that whole hierarchical enterprise. And even then, they get the whole oral tradition argument wrong. They like to teach you in seminaries about the parlor game where you whisper something in someone's ear and they whisper it in somebody else, and you go around the circle, and the story has changed completely, and poof, that proves the fact that you cannot transmit anything safely or securely by means of oral tradition. Well, every old society in the world, you go to the Aborigines in Australia, and their oral traditions are literally memorized, so that they can be recited word for word, and that's the way things have been passed down. So, we have this modern Western European presumption, not only about progress scientifically, but about devolution textually. That just does not, to my mind, square too well with the known facts of that region of the world. I'm just not a subscriber to that whole academic enterprise.
Well, okay. If we go back to our crystals,
Mm-hmm.
The crystal skull,
Mm-hmm.
all of that. What about the Tower of Babel, Joseph? Is there any indication that, because Scripture says, that God looked into what they were doing, and he went down there and he says, oh boy,
Mm-hmm.
If those people are allowed to do this, they'll be able to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, it had to do with some kind of technology.
Oh, yeah, so I think very clearly it does. And again, I'm not ruling out of the equation or the picture the standard traditional spiritual explanation.
Right.
I'm not trying to do that. I want to emphasize that to people. I'm simply trying to ask them to look at another aspect of the problem, and more importantly, to look at what the text actually says, and what it actually says is precisely what you just said, and that is that they would be able to do whatsoever they imagined to do.
Yes, imagined.
Yeah, imagined to do.
Interesting word.
I'm not certain of what the Hebrew underlying is, but the King James translation there is interesting because they use that specific word. And to me, it's interesting in that it does not appear to be so much a moral judgment as it were a political one. It's almost as if we have a case of the United States worrying about Iran possessing nuclear weapons, and no one else can have our kind of toys on the block but us.
Yeah.
Or the Russians, we grudgingly let them have it because they have it. But, it sounds to me like something political as much as moral is going on there. And it does seem to imply a technology. And it's very interesting when you get into the biblical and Sumerian connections between them. Because the Sumerian god, Ninurta, who is, of course, the god that's put in charge of going after these stolen tablets of destinies and, of course, fighting a war to regain them. Well, his name in certain Sumerian dialects was spelled N as in Nancy, M, R, and in some cases D. N-M-R-D. Nimrod.
Wow.
So in other words, there is even a Sumerian background to that passage, most likely. Because the name Nimrod, when translated into other dialects, is Ninurta.
Ninurta, yeah.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, people might object, well, that can't be because Nimrod is bad and he's trying to set up this world empire and do all these bad things. He's a mighty hunter before men, yada, yada, yada. And Ninurta is this good guy trying to regain these tablets of destinies and prevent their evil use. Okay? Well, it happens to be the case that Ninurta, if you look at the Sumerian legends, does exactly what everybody else does who gets their hands on these tablets of destinies. Once he recovers them after this war, what does he do? He keeps them for himself. So,
what's changed?
Yeah, what's changed, It's like I said before. It's like we're watching a bad soap opera, and it doesn't matter which one we tune into, CBS, NBC, or ABC. It's the same soap opera. So to me, it's just one of those amazing little quote-unquote coincidences that really, to me, says that, again, we're dealing here probably with a dimly remembered history, and that we cannot discount these things. The higher critics, of the Old Testament, or liberal critics, or whatever you wish to call them, just have a real hard time wrapping their mind around anything prior to, maybe Exodus chapter 3 as having any real historical validity. Well, to me, the other problem that this spells is, why then do you have such weird common little themes like I just disclosed? Why do you have these dimly remembered memories and presented slightly differently in every world culture? But they're still there. You can't get rid of them just by wishing they'd go away.
Well, now, Joseph, I've had a stroke in the past. And when this happened, the printed word didn't look right. Even though in my mind, in my head, I knew how to spell the word cat, C-A-T.
Right.
But it didn't look right when I would spell it. When I would hear somebody talk, it was like they were talking in a foreign language, and I couldn't understand them. And it took a lot of time and tears and hours in front of a computer, forcing myself to write, just write anything as long as I was writing.
Right.
And eventually, my brain rebuilt new pathways.
Right.
Okay. Tower of Babel. Everybody's language is confused.
It's scrambled.
And when I read that, and then I had this stroke, I thought of that, and I wondered, could this have been some technology?
Oh, sure. I think
that caused the people to, kind of like have a stroke.
Right. I have no doubt that this is probably, building on the foundation we've been building in all these sessions. I have no doubt that something like that is probably the cause of what happened or occurred there. Because one of the interesting things about linguistics, and that's kind of another hobby of mine, is that if you look at the kind of transformational generative approach that Chomsky pioneered, and that basically has become more or less the foundation of modern linguistic study, you will find these odd, almost universal grammatical constructions that the human mind is able to conceive of. But interestingly enough, the linguists before him were after kind of a different thing in a different way. They weren't trying to approach it deductively like Chomsky. They were trying to approach it inductively. And they would point out, by comparative etymology, the similarities between languages in weird ways.
Yes.
For example, the German word gross, G-R-O-S-S, it means big or great or
yes.
grand. But listen to what I'm saying. Listen to the smallest little unit of sound that I'm using, which is ger,
yes.
G-R, okay? Well, interestingly enough, in language types, like the Romance language, grandir in French, grande, grand in English, but you can find the same sort of GR phoneme, as a linguist would call it, in Dutch, groot, where the G is softened. You can find it in the Slavic, in Russian, хороший, but that doesn't mean grand or great, it means good. So, the linguists were looking at these things and they were saying, well, why that sound for these specific things? Great, grand, good, a big harvest or a great harvest is good, things of this nature. So there's all sorts of these strange little things that keep popping up even there. And, they were really after the quest in the 19th century in linguistics, they were after the quest for kind of a monogenesis. They were looking at, or for, the possibility that all human languages come from or stem from some common root. And, of course, the biblical story is that it did. But, you find similar legends in the most unlikely places. So, the Bible is not unique in this particular case. It's just preserving something that appears to be a legacy of something far older that humanity remembers for whatever reason. And I think you're right here. I think that scrambling kind of screwed up the neural pathways so that Germans and Dutchmen couldn't talk to each other anymore in spite of the similarity of their languages.
Yeah.
Or French, or Italians and Spaniards, or Spaniards and Portuguese, I was kind of dumbfounded, I thought of that because I downloaded a document recently in my researches that was in Portuguese, and, I know a smattering of Spanish, enough to get me in trouble. So I'm looking at this thing, I'm trying to figure out what does this say, and I finally realized I'm not reading Spanish because I recognized one of the word roots as being Portuguese. So, then it all kind of unraveled for me, and I thought, well, you blockhead, that's why.
Portuguese is a softer
language
than Spanish.
Yes, it is. It is
more musical.
Yeah, and all those Romance languages are, of course, really related because they're dialects that decayed over the centuries of Latin. So, you get all of these strange things that go on in human languages. And I do think that there is something to the idea that maybe something was done that scrambled the neural pathways of certain groups of people that had been speaking one language before, that they could no longer understand each other. And I think that's an interesting, if you look at it again, if you look at the biblical story again from this kind of political point of view, that's an interesting strategy.
Oh, yes.
Because, it's my supposition, and I mentioned this in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, it's my supposition that besides one language of everyday ordinary discourse, that they had one language of science. In other words, they had a profoundly unified physics. And it was probably profoundly unified with biology as well. So the thing to do if you're dealing with someone of that scientific sophistication, which in turn would represent a vast potential power and ability to lord it over others, so to speak, who weren't as sophisticated, the perfect way to unhinge that whole enterprise is not by blowing up their planet. Why deal with it with sledgehammers? when you can simply plant, so to speak, a computer virus and simply make them be able to understand each other.
Wouldn't that be? Yeah.
It's sneaky and it's dirty and it's rotten and it's precisely the sort of thing you would do against someone in that position.
Sure.
So, it's a story that, to me, I'm sorry, higher critics, but if you are listening, it's a story, to me, that makes political and technological sense.
Yes, it does. Yes. Well, okay. When we talk about ancient texts, the Torah, particularly the Torah, has different levels of meaning hidden in it. Hebrew seems to facilitate that
very
well.
Yes,
yeah.
it does.
And, one man can read one passage and come up with one idea, and the guy next door reads the same passage, Joseph, and he has a different level, a different take on it, and they, and then they start butting heads. I'm right. No, I'm right.
Well, in terms of just the whole Bible and Bible only doctrine, you and I have talked at great length off the air. I do not come at it from that theological tradition at all.
I don't either.
But
so many.
It's not just the fault of the Hebrew. I mean,
right.
You can say that of any language translation of the Old Testament, or for that matter, the New. You get a situation where this Bible and Bible only religion has given us 30,000 different flavors of Protestant evangelicalism. Each with their own slightly different emphasis. I'm just not sympathetic to that. I'm not from that tradition. I have no sympathy with it for it. It just leaves me cold. But it is true, to answer your question about the Hebrew.
Okay.
It is true that Hebrew is an extremely flexible, it's a powerful language in the sense that a computer programming language is powerful. It is able to do things, to convey with great concision a great deal of sophistication. Greek is another of these languages that does the same thing. German is another. Russian, any of these languages, the older they are, it seems to be the more sophisticated and powerful a language that they are. Hebrew, there are peculiarities of the Hebrew that make it so. So it's natural that you can have these sorts of arguments erupting, because it is capable of so many, as you say, and I think rightly and very aptly, it does exist. That text does exist on a multitude of levels. So it's only normal in a certain sense that these things arise.
Well, sure, but it seems as though there's things coded in there that were not understood until the advent of the computer.
Well, I've looked into the Bible code. I'm not yet decided one way or the other about it. I've noticed some strange peculiarities.
Yes.
But then again, I think that there may have been some methodological inconsistencies with it. So, on that question, I'm not prepared to go there yet. But with the idea that concepts are there,
yes,
with the idea that there may be technologies that we're dealing with there, that this is yet another piece of this ancient, pre-existing, very high civilization puzzle, that I definitely think is there. But again, as I've mentioned many times before in these installments, I am reluctant to comment at great length about them because I'm not quite certain in my mind, number one, how to go about them, and number two, even if I were inclined to do so, I would have to literally take your listenership through an unlearning process to get out of their heads this modern American Baptist civil religion thing that people think is early Christianity or biblical Christianity, and re-educate them in the plain, hard, bald, naked, unpleasant facts that religion never existed before the 16th century.
You're right.
So, unpleasant as that may sound, but for me to comment, I would literally have to do so much theological spade work in preparation for anything that I might say to be intelligible that it's very, very difficult for me to comment any further. I feel reasonably secure in saying that I do think in a few instances, like you point out with the Tower of Babel and things of this sort, that we are dealing most probably with a technology of some sort that is in play. But the context for understanding it, to me, seems to be clearly indicated by the fact that the Old Testament is a book and the Hebrews are a people that move back and forth between Sumer and Egypt. That's our clue. That's our context. And therefore, to understand these things, we have to go to that wider cultural context in which they move and look at those myths and see what's going on there. And then I think we're in a position possibly to make some preliminary conclusions. And, even then I think we have to be careful because we also have to put the Sumerian and Egyptian context for all of this academic speculation into an even wider context that would include China and India and Mesoamerica and South America and Scandinavia and so on, because all of these cultures have their own versions of this story.
That's true. And it's amazing that the story is so similar.
Well, yeah, let's cite one example. The Exodus, the incident of the burning bush. Moses comes along, God talks to him out of the burning bush that's burning and not consumed. Okay? Well, interestingly enough, I think it's either the it's the Omaha Indians in North America that have a legend of God creating things out of a burning bush.
Yes.
And I mentioned this in the Cosmic War. And then, as if to compound matters, the animals then set off into the 4 cardinal compass points. Which to me sounds, again, a little suspiciously too much like the description of the Garden of Eden and the 4 rivers and so on and so forth. Which of these versions are we to take as the original?
That's a good question.
Yeah. And even barring that question, if you don't want to go there, then there is an even bigger and much more unpleasant question. And that is, how do the Omaha Indians know about it?
Yes. Yeah.
Who told them? Ancient Hebrews? Unlikely. Ancient Egyptians? A little more likely, but why would they be telling the story?
Yeah.
So, any way we slice this historical pie, it gets more and more difficult. That's why I'm so very, very hesitant to address the theological issues, because they and the historical issues are related.
Yes, they are.
They dovetail into each other very, very peculiarly, and I don't think that I or anyone else in this alternative field of research has yet assembled enough of the pieces into a coherent theoretical framework, because, number one, there are so many pieces to assemble.
Yes.
You know, it's not just a few anomalous artifacts or tablets or things of this sort here and there that we're dealing with. We're dealing with vast volumes of literature that, you know, in our case, in the English language, aren't even translated into English. The Mahabharata is several volumes in the Sanskrit, and yet the whole thing has never been translated, at least not to my knowledge, and if it has, it's not easily available. I mentioned the Kang Shur in the last episode, the Tibetan Buddhist volume or epic. Again, you're dealing with hundreds of volumes, never been translated or even seen in any Western language, much less the volumes themselves. You know, there's just vast amounts of this material. So to sit down and be able to sift it all and put it into a coherent whole, you know, that's why I always say in my books, I am offering a hypothesis here,
yes,
not a theory, because there's so much more data that one would have to assimilate and consume and then put together to make a theory.
Oh, yes.
It's just a daunting enterprise.
Well, Joseph, when we look at, just briefly, in Genesis, the flaming sword that guards, you know, that God put there to guard, so keep people out. You know, that's, I don't know. I mean, that's a technology of some kind.
Well, yes, you know, again, it would seem so. There, I think you have an interesting spiritual implication.
Oh, yes.
Because what he's trying to do is protect mankind from going back and eating of the tree of life. The implication being
Hillary
that
Clinton could live forever.
The implication being that, you know, mankind would achieve such longevity in his state of evil.
Yes.
You know, and I mentioned this in the Giza Death Star, but not in specific reference to the fall of man and the banishment from Eden. But I do mention this general idea in at the end of the Giza Death Star. If you can imagine, and one interesting thing, a parallel between the Old Testament and some of these Sumerian myths, is that they both indicate that people at one time lived a lot longer.
Oh, yes.
A lot. You know, the Bible is really kind of a piker when you compare its ages for the antediluvian patriarchs.
Oh, yeah.
To the ages
King's
of
list.
to the Sumerian king's list, or for that matter to Manetho's list of the Shem-Suhor, you know, the Shem-Suhor kings in Egypt, who also lived these enormously long lifespans. So, you know, I posed the question in the Giza Death Star. Well, you know, if we had a sophisticated science, we had a sophisticated medical science and genetic science and everything else that went with it. And people probably did live a whole lot longer. So if you can imagine a Mother Teresa having thousands of years to do her work, but you could also imagine a Joseph Stalin or an Adolf Hitler or a Chairman Mao doing the same thing. You know, excuse me. And it's interesting that an early Christian saint, a 4th century saint by the name of St. John Chrysostom, comes right out and says in one of his commentaries on the New Testament that the reason that mankind dies is it cuts off his growth in evil. It is actually death which gives mankind the possibility of repentance and not becoming so corrupted in evil that he cannot ever get out of it.
Well, that's a good point, because remember before the flood how long people were living, And that...
that's my point.
Yeah, and God said, I've got to go down there and get rid of this. I've got to wipe it out. Because men's hearts were continually focused on evil.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and the consequence here, let's look at the technological aspect of what's being said there.
Yes.
Because if you can imagine a society where human beings, ordinary, off-the-street human beings, are living hundreds, if not thousands of years, then the growth of that society's science will be exponential.
Oh, yes.
Because you will not have to recycle all of human knowledge within every generation of 20 to 30 years. Instead of having people focused on their own narrow discipline, they will have time to assimilate others. So in other words, you will have a society where the literacy in almost every field of human academic endeavor is exponentially higher, not only within that field, but across them. So, in other words, you are dealing with something not, and again, I've mentioned this before, but I mention it again, in reference to the Tower of Babel.
Yes.
You are dealing with a society that has a profoundly unified science. At the highest levels, there is no real distinction between psychology, philosophy, and religion, or between physics and biology and, socioanthropology and so on. It is that formally explicit because they have the time to develop it. Whereas we are in the position that our famous scientists go down in life for maybe one or two important discoveries, and then that's it. So the picture of society is very different. And in this respect, again, this is why I strongly think that the modern biblical critics and academics of biblical studies are simply missing the picture. Because all the indicators for the existence of this society is there, and therefore the biblical story, or the biblical version of it, is no less able to be seen as referring to something historical. But we've got to take our spiritual blinders off and quit looking at it as solely a spiritual thing. There's also a politics and a science implied. As the further back you go in the Old Testament, the more that is the case.
Yes. Amazing, but that's true. You and I have talked about Moses, and we've talked about Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
And Lucifer, it says, that he was created, and the workmanship, that's an interesting word, of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in the day. They were perfect when they were created. Okay. It's almost, Joseph, like they're talking about a machine or something that is not, it's not human, whatever it is. And it lost its covering. And after that, we've had a lot of problems. But were there, I wonder if crystals were involved in this entity.
Oh, yes. You have to, you read no further than Ezekiel, where it mentions the stones in Lucifer's crown. And I've referred to this before, I think, way back in the second or third installment. And I mentioned it in the Giza Death Star Destroyed in the second to the final chapter, that Lucifer's crown has 12 crystals.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
And they are exactly the same stones that you find in the high priest's ephod.
Ephod, yeah. Oh, my gosh.
So,
Yes.
And interestingly enough, Ezekiel presents things in almost a Sumerian way, because it's when Lucifer loses that crown.
Yes.
Or it's kind of like Ezekiel had been sitting down reading J.R.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion, because when he loses that crown, he loses something of his power and authority and hegemony over things, and falls. Now, I should stress that the biblical account there permits you either to say that he fell and then the crown was taken away from him, or as a result of losing his crown, he fell. You see, this is a slight distinction.
Yeah.
But again, I think, we can entertain safely without losing sight of the spiritual dimensions of things. I think we can entertain safely that there's a technology involved. And again, it's very peculiar that these things wind up the Jewish high priest's ephod.
Yeah, well, when you look at that ephod and the way it's described, I see a telephone keypad.
A keypad, telephone keypad would be very similar to the arrangement of the stones on the ephod.
Yeah, calling home.
Yeah, so to speak, yeah.
Well, there's 2 stones missing, are there not?
Well, interestingly enough, I get into that in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, because, it's obviously these are stones of power again.
Yes.
We have 12 stones, 12 tribes, 12 signs of the zodiac, and so on and so forth. So again, we're confronted with all these odd little esoteric connections that are there, but most people don't want to think about them.
Yeah.
But there was a book published, I forget the exact title, I cited in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, where some English researchers traced some of these ephod stones through the centuries via the Templars, and ended up at some little hidden cache in an old English churchyard, where they found 3 stones that were onyx and beryl and jasper, I think, were the 3 that they found. And I believe it was the onyx stone that had some, as they soon discovered, some rather peculiar properties. So in other words, to me, I mention this story because clearly somebody out there is looking for this stuff that seems to go missing from time to time.
Well, it's been suggested that was one of the reasons that they wanted to go into Iraq, was to try to find some.
Well, I several installments ago I mentioned this, that prior to our invasion by the United States and the United Kingdom, the French and the British had archaeological teams there digging around Iraq for Saddam Hussein at his behest. And prior to the invasion, those teams were told, we're coming in, you'd better get out, if you want to be safe.
Yes.
So the French and the Germans, they pull their archaeological teams out of there. Now, interestingly enough, the Germans were the ones that kept the catalog of what they were digging up and putting into the Baghdad Museum. And there's that connection again to Germany.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and we get there. We have the Baghdad Museum looting, which, if you dig into the story, it appears to be an inside job by somebody.
Yes.
Although most people think we did it. I'm not in that school. I think it was either the French or the Germans, or possibly both.
Yeah.
Okay?
I agree.
The reason I say that is that the German government's Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is kind of their kinder, gentler Gestapo, I guess you'd call it, would have a very heavy on-the-ground presence to this day in Iraq. These are the same people that brought Andreas Strassmeyer out of this country, after the Oklahoma City bombing. That's a whole other story. But they have a very capable intelligence service, just like the Russians and the Israelis and just about any other major influential country in the world. So they have this heavy presence there, and could have easily pulled off something like that if they had the mind to. So I suspect that there are any number of players or potential suspects behind that looting. But we were told that we went in there to prevent Saddam Hussein from getting weapons of mass destruction. Well, everybody thinks in terms of nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons.
Right.
But it is an interesting mythological context, because the whole point I'm making in the Cosmic War concerning these tablets of destiny, these crystals of power, or whatever, is that if you read those mythological texts, they are clear in their implications that whatever these objects were, number one, some of them survived.
Yes.
Number two, they were hidden away. And in some cases, the texts even hint that they were hidden around quote-unquote religious places or temples. What better place to hide a weapon?
Oh, yes.
Put your A-bomb under the altar sort of thing. So, it may have been that the powers that be that told us we're going in there looking for weapons of mass destruction were in their own way telling us the truth, but simply letting us draw the conclusion that, well, we're looking for weapons of mass destruction, we're looking for atomic bombs and poison gas and things of this nature, when in fact we may have been looking for what exactly Saddam Hussein was looking for. He considered himself a reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes.
It was just very interesting. What's this man, this dictator, whose library is full of works of Stalin and Hitler?
Yeah.
And one only can guess at what else. Why is he sponsoring these digs, and what's he really looking for? So I don't rule that out of possibility. I don't rule that out of court at all. And it's the favored method of operation of these people to combine several objectives for an operation into one neat, tidy little package.
Of course.
And I mentioned Germany, and I think I've mentioned this before. Germany had a heavy on-the-ground presence in Iraq during World War II, and in fact, even prior to it. Vast networks of spies inside of Iraq. They helped sponsor the 1941 Iraqi coup. They put into place a pro-Nazi government. And, of course, the British had to go in and clean it out in 1943. So they had a heavy on-the-ground presence. But even then, even after the British military invasion in 1943, that German network, that Nazi network, was still on the ground and still inside of Iraq. And the reason I say that is because, in July of 1944, the bomb plot took place against Hitler. Hitler executed a bunch of people, and he executed the admiral that was the head of German military intelligence. His name was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. And Canaris was the one that was running this network of spies inside of Iraq. That network was turned over, of course, to Heinrich Himmler, to the SS. And Himmler, in turn, appointed an individual to head up specifically that Iraqi network of spies. And he happened to be none other than Baron Rudolf von Sebottendorf. And if you dig around long enough, you'll find that Baron Rudolf von Sebottendorf was the man that founded the Tula Gesellschaft, the secret society that helped midwife the Nazi Party into existence.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes. So, here is a clear occult secret society connection, and now he's running that network of spies in Iraq. And just to add a little final bit of icing to this very strange cake, at the end of the war, von Sebottendorf turns up dead, floating in the Bosporus, outside of Istanbul, Turkey. So, in other words, there's all of these very weird, very strange goings-on in that country. And the strangest players are people like these representing interests of the great powers. So there's no question in my mind, none whatsoever, that there is a deeply covert and esoteric agenda taking place in that country, and it has precisely to do with recovering whatever they can of the elements of this lost technology. No doubt in my mind whatsoever.
Wow. Oh, my goodness. Well, I can understand why they want to get their hands on that.
Sure.
And a lot of that technology could be in what was once called Persia.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And, the other the other places that, if you look at these mythological texts from that region, where they indicate things may have gone, Persia is the obvious place because, of course, the Persian invasion of Babylon, Cyrus the Great, of course, takes back to Shushan as much of the Babylonian treasures as he can lay his hands on, So there's no doubt that some of that ancient Sumerian stuff made its way into Persia and disappears under the sands. Plus, you have the Avestas, which are the old Zoroastrian texts that have always, been associated with the region. So you've got all this taking place there. But the other thing that those Sumerian texts indicate as possible places where that lost technology of power disappeared to is, of course, Egypt being one, and probably the primary one. But here's the real curveball. Read the text carefully enough, and you're going to discover that there are over and over and over and over, with an almost monotonous repetitiveness, this connection to Mars.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And so, positing what we've posited for that civilization, some of that technology may have either come from there or at the end of this war made its way back there.
Wow. Yeah, I know that Mars is going to play a role in the future. I'm not just sure how, but
it already is. Why is there this mad scramble on the part of China, Japan, India, Russia, and Europe to go to the moon? And, and they're all very clear, including us, that, the moon is just sort of the staging ground on the way to Mars.
Yes.
Why not Venus?
Yeah.
It's just as close, So there's to me, again, there's some reason everybody is heading in one direction. And there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Mr. Hoagland is absolutely correct in his interpretation of the recent U.S. Navy satellite shoot-down.
Yes.
We were sending messages, political messages, to those other interested spacefaring nations that they better not go there.
Well, I don't doubt that one little bit. I'll tell you, Joseph, because it's, I believe very strongly, and I was so glad when Richard Hoagland also said that, there's this public space program.
And a secret covert one.
You betcha.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think there are certain people that have cars and run their houses, and it's not on solar, it's not on electricity, it is being done by some other technology that they're just not going to bring out and let us have.
Well, I have no doubt that there is a suppressed technology. I mean, you cannot read things like My SS Brotherhood of the Bell or Igor Vitkovsky's Truth About the Wunderwaffe and so on and so forth, or Henry Stevens' Hitler's suppressed and still secret weapons. Another excellent work. You cannot read books like that and come away with any other than the impression that somebody sure did a whole lot of something extraordinary inside of Nazi Germany, and it went somewhere. And
yes,
somebody has it now. It didn't just stop.
Yes. Well, it's like the ship, the Philadelphia.
Oh yeah.
And they say, well, gee, that was dangerous stuff, and we're not going to mess with that.
Oh no,
give me a break.
No, listen. This new book coming out, I'm glad you brought that up, because we can bring that up now. Since the book is out, I can talk about it.
Oh, cool.
I combined a book on the Philadelphia experiment and the Naziville very deliberately, because as readers of the book will find out, I believe that both of these super secret projects were rationalized on more or less the same scientific basis. Slightly different one in America than in Nazi Germany, but the basic conceptual thinking was there.
Yes.
And one of the things that I came to the conclusion, and it's way at the end of the book, you have to read, the whole thing to get it set up properly, is that, and this dumbfounded me, that no one has commented on this fact. I basically go back in the book and take the primary reliable sources for the story, namely Morris Jessup and Charles Berlitz and William Moore.
Yes.
And of course, it's the Berlitz-Moore book that really put that whole story on the map. And I go back and I actually find some of their primary sources, specifically the Varro edition of Jessup's work, and reprint some of that in this book. The Varro edition all but dropped off the face of the earth after Brad Steiger had published portions of it in Argosy magazine way back in the 1970s. It just sort of literally disappeared. And I did this for one reason, is to just kind of flesh out things that Berlitz and Moore do not say in the Philadelphia experiment, nor do I think they realize the significance of these things in Jessup's book. People may be asking, well, why is he writing a book about the Philadelphia experiment after writing a book about the Cosmic War? And I don't do anything without, I don't do things haphazardly. There is a reason, and the reason is because the Cosmic War is talked about in the Varro edition. And I have to put myself in the position of those Navy officers that had it printed up, because they're reading these annotations and they're scratching their heads and they're thinking, my word, there's something going on here. We better find out what it is. So they print this thing up, and in the Berlitz-Moore book, they say that it's distributed to the top Navy people on the Project Orbiter Committee. And Berlitz and Moore present a picture in their book, and they missed the significance of what they were seeing. And it's truly significant. It is a picture of the Project Orbiter Committee, and sure enough, sitting there at the table on the far left side of the picture are the two Navy officers that were mentioned in the whole Philadelphia experiment story. Standing dead center in the picture is the president of the company that prints the Varro edition for the Navy. Okay? With me?
Oh, yes.
But sitting on the opposite side of the table, kind of alone, as if he's holding court, is none other than Dr. Werner von Braun.
Oh, boy. Oh, my goodness. Yes, holding court.
So, holding court.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's my speculation based on everything that Berlitz and Moore say, based on everything that I've been leading up to in Reich of the Black Sun, in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, in Cosmic War, and so on and so forth, that when Berlitz and Moore said that this book, this annotated book of Morris Jessup's, was distributed to their top people, that since we have the presence of so many of those Project Orbiter Committee people in the story, that probably one of the recipients of that book is none other than Wernher von Braun. Now, why is he getting a copy of a book about radar stealth, optical invisibility, and, of all things, teleportation? Well, isn't it peculiar? I then go on to note at the end of Secrets of the Unified Field. Isn't it peculiar that the Cooper Cantwheel Magic 12 documents, which some people still say are not authentic, and I haven't made up my mind, I must be honest with you, and I'll say why in a moment. But isn't it peculiar that those documents mention that it is precisely the paperclip Nazis that the military brings in to look at the Roswell wreckage because they suspect it looks kind of, quote-unquote, familiar?
Kind of.
And what do these Germans know about this? And one of the people mentioned explicitly is von Braun. Okay?
Wow.
So now my point is if those documents are not authentic and exercises in disinformation, then it would appear to be very well informed disinformation, because the only other piece of evidence, coincidentally or circumstantially, that exists that would suggest that von Braun was involved in something more than mere rocketry is his picture in this Project Orbiter Committee with the very people that are receiving copies of this Varro annotated edition about the Philadelphia experiment. Oh, my word.
Oh, yes.
You see? So, in other words, this kind of connects the dots and corroborates the case I was making way back in SS Brotherhood of the Bell. And since the Varro annotations themselves clearly indicate that there is a technology and an ancient cosmic war,
yes.
You see, these are the threads that are all being put together in a very peculiar way. And you really can't just put it out there, without the proper preparation. What's this doing here? Well, the fact of the matter is, I think, is that somebody, if we take all the indicators and clues that are in the Secrets of the Unified Field, this new book of mine, and the previous books, and put them together, it's very clear that by at least 1957, somebody in our government, some group inside of it, has connected the dots in a very similar fashion.
Yes.
And I even present evidence way, way at the end of Secrets of the Unified Field that they were probably putting the dots together much earlier than that, because we actually sent a raiding party into Czechoslovakia in 1946, and I present these documents. I found them in the National Archives, and as far as I know, this is the first time these documents have been presented to the public. We actually sent a team of U.S. Army commandos inside of Czechoslovakia in 1946. Now, that is an act of war.
Yes.
Yeah. By any recognized standard of international law. What were we doing in Czechoslovakia? Well, these documents, I can't get into the detail, obviously, on the radio, but the book, it's in the book. But basically,
oh, what a cliffhanger! I love it.
Well, Well, basically the story is that we went in to take out some documents.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
documents? And they come up with this wonderful cover story in the documents that I uncovered. And needless to say, the Czech government isn't buying. A minor international incident starts to ensue over this whole thing. But one thing is very interesting that these documents that I uncovered mention is that we were going in to take out 12,000 pounds of documents.
12,000
pounds. 6 tons.
Wow.
So in other words, this isn't going to be accomplished by a team of commandos, 4 or 5 men, parachuted into Czechoslovakia, stealing a folder from a safe and spiriting it back across the border.
Right.
This has got to be done with at least 1 truck.
Yes.
And enough people to lift all of this stuff,
yes.
make sure it's crated and packaged properly, and so on and so forth, and get it out of there. So, you know,
it's amazing.
Yeah, it is, and it's even more so once you read these documents because I reproduce them, I type them up so that you can actually read, you know, without having to squint, and then I reproduce a photocopy of the documents in the book so that you can actually see I'm not making this stuff up, you know. And I give the archive references and everything else for this. But, you know, what are we doing in Czechoslovakia looking for documents in 1946? So, you know, and I think I know the answer. But, you know, it would take a long time to explain and set up.
Okay, well, someday.
Well, I want people to read the book, obviously. I don't want to spoil it.
Oh, Joseph, yes, absolutely. They've got to read the book. I am stunned by the information and your precision in your writing. I mean, you are very, very precise. And that is a real gift all by itself.
Well, you can thank the University of Oxford for that.
Wow.
You don't get through there without being precise.
Absolutely. Oh. You know, just kind of in closing,
mm-hmm.
You know, I look at the word divine.
Mm-hmm.
In English,
mm-hmm.
D-I is being two,
mm-hmm.
and vine being vine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the
mm-hmm.
second vine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always stuck in my head, as opposed to human, the vine or the second vine
mm-hmm.
of what? You know, the fallen ones, hybrid, what, you know, I mean, lots of stuff goes through my head.
Mm-hmm.
But we have Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses, just like a lot of other people in history throughout time, there's, you know, he's found floating in the river.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
No father.
Right.
You know, and I mean,
taken into the king's house.
Yeah.
Adopted as a son. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, I mean, I hate to say this, but you look at Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
They come out. Oh, he you know, he really didn't have a father.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's taken into the house of Rothschild. You know,
mm-hmm.
I mean, these little
vignettes
that go through my head. But this business with Moses, he had a sapphire.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
mm-hmm.
and do we think of that sapphire as maybe one of the tablets of destiny, maybe one of the missing stones from the ephod, or?
Well, I don't think that there is a direct connection with either.
Okay.
The sapphire that you speak of is in Hebrew sexthia, is, if you read carefully, it's, according to some traditions, it was the first form of the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
Were written on this. It was destroyed, and then, of course, he recarved it on just regular stone. But at least that's the Jewish tradition.
Okay.
But to me, it's interesting. Again, you have a crystal that is ultimately intended to be placed in the ark, which, again, is a suspiciously technological piece of equipment. You know, they've actually built replicas of the ark. I think the University of Minnesota or somebody up over east of me did this a few years ago. And they actually discovered that this thing was a capacitor. It stored enormous amounts of static electricity, you know, so you didn't, which would be, you know, explainable on the way that the ark is constructed. But the unusual thing here is that there, again, you have this peculiar combination of technologies, it would appear.
Yeah.
You know, and another interesting thing, I think you actually mentioned it yourself in one of these earlier installations, that the inside of the coffer in the Great Pyramid is to the exact dimensions of the Ark of the Old Testament, of the Covenant. So again, you know, we're dealing with, I think, pieces of a technology that become fragmented, number one, and declined from their original condition, number two. So it's hard telling. I don't think that there is a direct connection, but I do think that there's a connection in terms of this leitmotif that has been with us all along in terms of ascribing power to crystals and so on and so forth, that here again you find it in yet another place and in a peculiar place. So, Moses, I think, again, putting it into his context, after all, he reached the upper pinnacles of power and prestige in ancient Egyptian society. And, you know, the biblical account of his conflict with the Egyptian priests appears to be a contest of whose magic, or if you will, science, is stronger. So, you know, there are any number of things, and I even mentioned in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, I spend a great deal of time with this, in fact, in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, the whole episode of him taking the golden calf, melting it down and burning it to the point that it becomes a powder.
Yes.
Which he has the people eat. Oh. You know, well, if you know anything about alchemical literature, this is alchemical from top to bottom. And as I mentioned in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, there is a strong possibility that's mentioned by Sir Lawrence Gardner, and I refer to this in the Giza Death Star Destroyed. There's a strong possibility that one of the places that Moses just happened to stop off along the way to Canaan during the wandering in Sinai was a temple that was found by Sir William Flinders Petrie, who, of course, is the pyramidologist of all pyramidologists.
Yeah.
Even kind of the founder of modern Egyptology.
Didn't he do a little dance in a tutu? There's a story about him, I think, so he could get to go into the pyramid. Well,
I don't know about that, but the real point I'm making is Petrie found this temple in Sinai.
Yes.
Egyptian temple, where they found all of this white powder that had been under the stones of the temple, hidden away.
Wow.
And, you know, if you examine this carefully, again, this appears to be that white powder of gold that is, again, clear indicator, if you know the alchemical texts, of having achieved the philosopher's stone. So, here again, you have a technological reference popping up at the oddest place in the Old Testament, and with a clear Egyptian provenance.
Didn't the philosopher's stone allow, the legend with it is that it could cure any illness, you could live forever?
That's one of them.
Yeah. There
are many supposed or alleged powers that are ascribed to it. You have to be very careful in sifting through some of these alchemical texts, because again, I'm convinced that the way you must do so is on the basis of weird little parallels that are beginning to come out in modern scientific literature. Extremely weird ones.
Can you read Old German and Old Latin? I've got a ton of alchemical texts.
Yes, you mean read the Old German script?
Yes.
Oh, yes, I can do that.
Yeah. I had a friend that used to work in the British Museum, and my friend made a lot of copies of old things, and I wound up with them.
Yes, I can read that stuff.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, those would be very interesting to read.
Oh, yeah.
Especially the German ones. They're again, Germany for some reason seems to be the European locus for a lot of this activity, and it goes way, way back.
Yes.
The famous German-Swiss alchemist Paracelsus, and even earlier than that, you find some pretty strange goings on there. So, I'm not inclined to dismiss it, because one of the things that we have to ask ourselves. I'm writing a book right now in which alchemy is a major theme.
Oh my.
Yet the next installment in this vast literature I seem to be churning out. But one of the things that, the obvious question is that people are, for all of our scientific progress or alleged progress in the last 2 centuries, we are no more nor less rational than we have ever been.
Yeah. We certainly haven't got smarter.
Well, yeah, but, we certainly haven't got dumber either.
Yeah.
And, people way back in ancient times weren't irrational. In the New Testament itself it says that St. Joseph was minded to put St. Mary away, because virgins just don't conceive all that often.
Yeah.
So, there's rationality taking place, and people are observant and know these things. Well, the big question with alchemy then, you can trace it back to ancient Egypt. That's very clear. You can trace it back to ancient China, which is yet another one of those very strange connections.
Oh, yes.
So the question is, for all those centuries, while you have these alchemists toiling and laboring in their dark, murky, musky laboratories over crucibles and beakers and flasks and everything else, inhaling mercury vapors and all the other stuff,
Yeah.
In all those centuries that they're doing this, precisely in order to confect the philosopher's stone, if it had been so unsuccessful, why did they keep doing it?
Good question. Yeah.
Why were people engaged in such a futile exercise if there had been centuries of data to the contrary that it could not be done?
Yeah.
Well, the reason why I'm saying that is that if you read those alchemical texts, every now and then you'll come across one where it's the eureka moment. I did it. And you sense this kind of surprise in these texts that they had actually done, they'd followed all these very obscure and arcane recipes that are barely intelligible. And they'd look for the certain little clues that everyone, and there is one set of clues that stands out from China to Germany that you have been successful. And I'm not going to divulge it because it's part of the new book. But there is a set of clues. And every now and then you run across somebody that, oh boy, I did it, you know. Yes. And oops, now that I've done it and see what this stuff actually does, I better be very circumspect about who I tell and how I tell it.
You're not kidding.
So, you know,
whoa.
But it's very interesting to me that at the Renaissance you have several claims that have been made of a successful completion. And some of them are in circumstances that just leave you scratching your head. For example, King Charles XII of Sweden. You know, when Sweden is at the height of her military power. Well, King Charles XII had condemned this Swedish general to execution for treason. And the general told him, well, spare my life if I show you how to make a philosopher's stone. Transmute base metals into gold. Well, you can imagine the reaction of a hard-headed Swede like King Charles. But, you know, he goes along with it. But he takes these extraordinary precautions against fraud. And yet at the end of this exercise, sure enough, much to everyone's surprise, it apparently was done. So, you know, you have these stories, and you have to wonder that if this was indeed such a futile exercise, why did it survive for so many centuries?
Right.
And why was such care taken to make these alchemical texts both as revealing and as concealing simultaneously as they could possibly be?
Oh, it drives you crazy when you try to read them.
Oh yeah, it does. If you don't follow the clues
yes.
to the modern scientific literature, and that's the story.
Oh, Joseph, you did it again.
I'm trying. I haven't done it yet. I'm still typing on this monster.
Oh wow. Well, go ahead, please, and give out the information on your two new books.
Okay, the newest book in this alternative science and physics research area is called Secrets of the Unified Field, subtitled The Philadelphia Experiment, the Nazi Bell, and the Discarded Theory. That is available now from Adventures Unlimited Press, and their number is 1-800-718-4514. I believe it's $18.95, and it does come with a 10% discount on 3 or more books. And I think they have an online, or pardon me, a 24-hour number for credit card orders too.
Yes, they do, and that number is 1-815-253-6390.
Right. That sounds right. And if they want to go online, it's www.adventuresunlimitedpress.com. That's all lowercase. Right. And again, I appreciate any donations that people can make to help me continue this research. And like I said on a prior installment, I'm getting to the point where I'm doing this full time, but it's not yet become quite a sustaining venture for me. So any help would be appreciated. The other new book is a strictly, and I've got to warn people here, it is a very academic, strictly theological, very conservative or traditional look at things, Christian history. And that's called God, History, and Dialectic. And the subtitle to that is The Theological Foundations of the Two Europes and Their Cultural Consequences. That is about 1,200 pages. It's an electronic book, and that can be ordered at www.byte, FILIOQUE.com, and that too is all lowercase.
Okay. God, history, and dialectic.
Right.
And I agree. This is not your feel-good Western Christian type of book. This is a very deep and serious study. Yes. It takes somebody that really wants to dig down into truth to really understand what's going on. And this book, for those that love the study, get this book. You've got to. So, anyway, with that said, please send some donations to Joseph P. Farrell. His address is 720 Jonas, Jonas, number 24, in Spearfish, South Dakota. Zip code 57783.
And I should mention that, again, if they want to use PayPal, I do have that up and working on my website.
Great.
And that is www.Giza, Death Star, all one word, all lowercase, .com.
Okay.
And I think you have that web link up on your site, too, don't you?
It'll go up as soon as this audio file goes up. And how do they buy the book, God, History, and Dialectic?
Again, that's at the website www.filioque.com.
Okay, great. Joseph.
Yeah, don't buy that one directly from me. I'm not involved with that process directly.
Okay. Wow. I don't know what else to say except wow. When we talk about a prolific author who produces extremely meaningful writings and books, you are him.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
We appreciate you. And so, everybody, you've got your marching orders. Get the books. Get the books. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with Joseph P. Farrell signing off tonight, and God bless every one of you out there that's listening. I'm sure that something you've heard tonight will really turn on a light for you. So, God willing, we'll be back. Good night, everybody.
The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee. Perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet. The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.